반갑습니다. 저는
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm your moderator today. My name is Lee Young from the Civil Peace Forum. This is a forum organized by KSM, the Civil Peace Forum,
프리드리히 에버트
Korea Women's Movement for Peace, and American Friends Service Committee, and the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung. We'd like to extend our appreciation to all the participants for coming to the international conference. The conference here is organized to seek an integrated approach for cooperation with North Korea for peace on the Korean Peninsula. We'd like to build on the achievements of the June conference that we had. We'd like to bring together different participants and players to promote peace on the Korean Peninsula. And we are now streaming the international conference through the YouTube channel we have at the YouTube. So now we'd like to begin the opening ceremony of the 2021 International Conference on Peace and Development on the Korean Peninsula. Now we'd like to invite President of KSM, the Choi Wan-gyu, to deliver the opening remarks. We now invite the Co-President of KSM, Choi Wan-gyu, to the podium.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, all participants. It's a pleasure to meet you. It's not long before the end of the year when we will be looking back on this year. I believe you will not feel that comfortable as we face the end of this year. Nearly 3 years have passed since all forms of exchange and cooperation projects between the two Koreas were completely suspended. There is still no hope of resumption. South Korea and the international community have been making great efforts to resume contact and exchange and cooperation projects with North Korea, despite North Korea's cold attitude and response. However, the results were not that good. I think it's largely due to the emphasis on self-assertion without properly understanding the other person's mind. There were even projects that could be misunderstood that they were only North Korea in name, but actually aimed at domestic political society. This was very painful. In such a difficult situation, we resumed cooperation projects with North Korea following June and held an international conference on cooperation with North Korea to seek peace on the Korean Peninsula. We cannot help but feel a sense of shame. Some people criticize that inter-Korean relations show no signs of improvement, but that only related meetings are dancing throughout this year. I believe our hearts cannot help but feel heavy. However, the worse the situation is, the more efforts we should make to think deeply and discuss to find alternatives. Don't you agree that crisis can be the power to create new opportunities depending on the effort? Above all, I'd like to express my special gratitude on behalf of the organizers for sympathizing with this awareness of the issue and participating again with a lot of interest in holding the International Conference on Cooperation with North Korea in November 2021. I would also like to express my warm gratitude to all domestic and foreign experts who actively agreed with the purpose of this meeting and who are willing to participate as moderators, presenters, and debaters. And you have always sympathized with the inter-Korean issue and cooperation. So I'd like to extend sincere gratitude to Director Enning Efnung, who has showed a great passion and devotion to this issue from the Frederick Ebert Foundation Korea. Dear participants, there is no new plan to resume exchange and cooperation with North Korea. Marcel Proust said that the path to great discovery is not to find a new land, but to look at the land in front of us. Rather than discovering a new exchange and cooperation project with North Korea, it is necessary to change the idea of existing business methods. With this in mind, I would like to replace the opening speech by emphasizing the following two facts once again. First of all, the most important fact is that we must respect the otherness of North Korea, which is a counterpart of exchange and cooperation projects. Over the past 2.5 years, when inter-Korean relations have stagnated, we must look back on ourselves and think whether not only the government but also local governments and civil organizations have truly considered North Korea's thoughts and concerns and have proposed and promoted projects accordingly. Sometimes, the humanitarian aid projects claimed by South Korea can be a very sensitive political issue for North Korea. The moment I capture or appropriate the other with my thoughts and language only, the other can no longer exist. What would be the point of a policy against a counterpart that does not exist? Another important fact is that peace issues between the two Koreas is fundamentally difficult to solve as long as South Korea's North Korean policy, including exchange and cooperation projects, becomes a dependent variable of the US policy on Northeast Asia and the Korean Peninsula. The reality of inter-Korean relations has shown this well since the breakdown of the Hanoi talks in February 2019. In order to overcome this difficulty and expand Korea's independence in North Korea's policies, active support from the majority of the people is necessary. And to do so, at least, I emphasize, at least, North Korea's policy needs to be separated from the general political sphere. The government, the ruling and opposition parties, as well as progressive and conservative camps, should create a policy governance or partial regime for North Korea in which both progressive and conservative camps participate. This would be a shortcut to expanding and strengthening policy sustainability and public consensus. Entering the presidential election phase, presidential candidates from the ruling and opposition parties are already offering different views and solutions to important issues between the two Koreas. This is like the North Korean Indians in their tribal conflict argues that their tribe are true human, but that the other tribe are not human. We can think of this analogy when looking at both the ruling and opposition parties competing against one another and blaming one another and criticizing each other. Under these circumstances, sustainable North Korean policies and exchange and cooperation projects will be impossible. It would also be difficult to expect any response from North Korea. The issue of the Korean Peninsula, especially the expansion of exchange and cooperation projects and the establishment of peace between the two Koreas, is always a task that the international community, as well as the South and North, should gather wisdom to solve. The four organizations, including the Korean Sharing Movement, is jointly holding this 2021 International Conference on North Korea Cooperation once again today, following June, because we all desperately share this awareness of the problem. I truly hope that the results and outcomes of today's meeting will be the concrete results of the Inter-Korean Exchange and Cooperation projects. In inter-Korean cooperation projects, South Korea has always been the subject and North Korea has always been the object. But this is not the natural way in our relationship. It should not be a subject or an object. We have to understand the concept of us and we. That notation is something that we should recover in order to truly resume and recover the initiation of inter-Korean cooperation projects. Thank you very much.
네, 양해
Thank you. We now ask for your kind understanding. We have some sound interruptions and we are not able to do a live streaming on YouTube for the Korean language. We'll make sure that the sound system is restored and will resume the streaming service. Once again, we advise that we're not able to do a Korean streaming on the YouTube.
캐리 케네디 AFSC 국제사업협동사무처장님의 환영사가 있겠습니다. 영상으로 만나 뵙겠습니다.
안녕하십니까. 저는 캐리 케네디입니다. 미국 친일봉사회 부사무총장입니다. 오늘 이 자리에 함께해서 큰 영광을 생각합니다. 시작하기에 앞서서 이 중요한 행사를 주역해 주신 우리민족 서러웃기 운동본부 시민평화포럼 여성평화운동 네트워크에 감사의 뜻을 표하고 싶습니다. 또 프리드 에버트 재단 한국사무소에도 깊은 감사의 말씀을 드립니다. 더불어서 이 행사를 주최해 준 데 후원해 주신 서울특별시와 대북협력 민간단체 협의회에 감사의 말씀을 전합니다. 1917년 설립된 미국 친우회는 세계 곳곳에서 지속가능한 평화와 정의, 균형을 도모하는 것을 목표로 활동하는 퀘이커 단체입니다. 우리는 모든 사람들에게 내재되어 있는 가치에 주목하고 있습니다. 100년 이상의 단체의 역사를 가지고 있으며 우리는 평화 구축을 위해서는 전 세계 다른 사람들의 안녕과 깊이 연결되어 있다고 믿는 사람들과 긴밀히 협력하는 것이 중요하다는 것을 배워왔습니다. 저는 미국 친일봉사회 부사무총장으로서 전 세계 파트너 단체들과 함께 평화롭고 정의로운 세계를 위해서 함께 일하는 특권을 누렸습니다. 저는 2019년과 2010년에는 아프가니스탄에서 국회의원 선거에 출마한 여성들을 지원하는 활동을 전개했습니다. 이들 다수는 큰 위험을 무릅쓰고 참여한 사람들이었습니다. 10여 년이 지난 지금 선거에 출마했거나 권리와 평화를 위해서 싸웠던 여성들은 좋은 친구들입니다. 10년 전 그들은 제게 미국에서 여성들의 정치 참여를 지지한 단체를 설립하였던 영감을 주었습니다. 저는 현재 평화로운 세계를 향한 비전을 가진 수백 명의 여성들을 활동하는 2개의 단체를 설립한 바 있습니다. 그리고 오늘 현재 아프간에서 우리는 파트너들과 함께 그곳을 떠나고자 하는 이들을 대피시키고 남아있는 이들에 대해서 인도 지원 사업을 진행하고 있습니다. 지난 몇 달간 수많은 언론들은 미군이 아프가니스탄에서 설치하게 된다면 이것은 미군 역사상 가장 지금 국외 전쟁의 종잡을 찍는 데 있어서의 결정적인 계기가 될 것이라고 말한 바 있습니다. 아프가니스탄의 현 상황이 이루 말할 수 없이 심각하다는 것은 의심의 여지가 없습니다. 그리고 아프간 전쟁이 가장 오래된 전쟁도
remains the forgotten war in the consciousness of the U.S. people. We in the United States must learn our lessons from continued warfare with enormous human costs. After 71 years, it's long past time for the U.S. to end this war and to take a new approach to the Korean Peninsula. AFSC's engagement with the Democratic People's Republic of Korea dates back to 1953. In the early 1980s, AFSC organized people-to-people exchanges with Korean partners and provided humanitarian assistance during the famine of the late 1990s. In 1997, AFSC was one of the first NGOs allowed to work directly with cooperative farms in North Korea. Today, our program helps farmers in the DPRK raise farm productivity. In the US, we also work to change policy and public opinion. In a recent public opinion poll commissioned by AFSC and conducted by Ipsos, a plurality agreed that the US should end its real longest war abroad by signing a peace treaty with North Korea. 35% they didn't know what should happen. I see this as a real opportunity to educate and to spread the seeds of understanding, which will ultimately change the relationship between the United States and DPRK. And we can't do this alone. We rely on each other, on partnership, on relationship, on cooperation with international friends around the world to plant and water the seeds of peace and reconciliation. Partnerships form the backbone of the work of the American Friends Service Committee. Our partnership with the Korean Sharing Movement is an example of how, when we come together, our ability to create change grows. I would like to thank the Korean Sharing Movement for bringing together such a wonderful, diverse group of speakers and topics under the overarching theme of seeking deeper ways to collaborate and cooperate for peace on the Korean Peninsula. Looking at the schedule of speakers and topics, I see a group who have a wealth of knowledge and experience to share. I wish I could stay for the whole time. I can't, but it would be wonderful to be with you through this whole period. I wish every success to participants and speakers in the coming days as we seek fresh ways to work together for peace. Thank you so much for inviting us, and AFSC is so happy to support this wonderful event. I wish you every success. Thank you.
네, 다음으로
And next, we'd like to invite Mr. Frederick Effner of the Frederick Effner Foundation, Korea.
Thank you very much. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you to this conference on peace and development on the Korean Peninsula. My name is Henning Effner. I'm the country director of the Frederick Ebert Foundation here in Seoul. Let me just very briefly introduce our organization to you. The Friedrich Ebert Foundation is a German political foundation. We have offices in about 100 countries around the world. We are very closely linked to the German Social Democratic Party, and our mandate is to promote social democracy and international understanding and cooperation. One of the main objectives of our work here in Korea is to promote inter-Korean relations. And for many years, we have been supporting civil society organizations in developing engagement policies with North Korea and in promoting dialogue and trust building. So for us, it's a great pleasure to be associated to this conference as a partner of the Korean Sharing Movement. We have been supporting this annual conference for many years, and I would like to use this opportunity to once again thank Mr. Cho, Mr. Hong, and all the colleagues from Korean Sharing Movement for the very trustful and very good cooperation we've had throughout these years. So this year's conference takes place at a difficult time. Cooperation with North Korea has basically come to a complete stop. Almost all foreign embassies and international aid agencies have left North Korea. So it's very difficult to actually get information on the situation on the ground. But I think one thing is clear, the humanitarian situation in North Korea has become very severe. So there's an urgent need to provide humanitarian assistance and to cooperate with North Korea to overcome the pandemic by providing vaccines, testing kits, and medicine. So I think we all seek to find ways to re-engage with North Korea, to restart dialogue and cooperation, and joint coordinated response to COVID-19 could be a possible starting point for this. And that's why I'm very glad this conference will provide us with an opportunity to exchange ideas on how to move forward in this regard. So I would like to thank the Korean Sharing Movement, the Civil Peace Forum, Korean Women's Movement for Peace, the American Friends Service Committee, the NGO, the Korean NGO Council for Cooperation with North Korea, and the Seoul Metropolitan Government for their really excellent cooperation. Thanks also to all the experts and participants for joining us. I think we have an excellent round of speakers, and I'm very much looking forward to our presentations and discussions. Thank you very much.
네, 감사합니다.
Well, thank you very much. This concludes the opening ceremony. We'd like to begin the main session today. And today's conference is going to be organized, hosted by the co-standing president, Woo Hee-jung of the Korea Sharing Movement.
Good morning and hello everybody. I'm Woo Hee-jung, the co-standing president of the Korean Sharing Movement. First of all, we have 4 presenters and also 3 designated discussants. This conference is being held both in Korea and the US simultaneously. In the US, I understand this is in the evening, so I'll do my best to keep within the schedule. So for the presenters, I like to give 20 minutes each and 10 minutes to the discussants. So, I like to send a sign, a beeping sound before 2 minutes, before 20 minutes for the presenters. And for the discussants, I'll send a beep sound 1 minute before 10 minutes. So please keep in mind that in the US, this is late in the evening, so let's all be aware of the time schedule. And after the presentations, we will have a Q&A session, and we will also share all the questions that are collected online. We will have about a 20-minute Q&A session. So since we seem to be slightly behind our schedule, we'll move on right away with the presentations. I'd like to introduce the first presenter, Mr. Daniel Jasper, the Advocacy Coordinator of the American Friends Service Committee. He will present on utilizing official dialogue processes to advance humanitarian development and peace-building issues in Korea. And please, Mr. Jasper.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I'm getting some feedback here. Wondering if there's some technical difficulties there. Okay, I'm sorry about that. I'm getting some feedback. But thank you so much for that introduction, Mr. Wo Hee-jung. And thank you to my fellow organizers, panelists, and participants. These conferences have been crucial to furthering our understanding of issues and events on the ground. And we at AFSC are deeply appreciated that they continue even as aid is temporarily halted. I also want to quickly say a word of remembrance for Mr. Lee Hong-woo. Many of you know Mr. Lee was a tireless advocate for peace and reconciliation in Korea. Word of his passing reached us recently. He was a former AFSC staff member and a true model of Quaker values in action. We trust his spirit will be with us during this conference. With that being said, I want to turn my attention to my presentation. Often this conference focuses on the substantive issues of humanitarian and peace issues between the US and North Korea. I would like to focus this presentation on potential starting point for discussions on the diplomatic processes required to address those issues. So my remarks will focus on drawing upon recent research on US-China dialogue that may, in part, be applicable to US-North Korea relations. While there are obvious differences in US-North Korea relations and US-China relations, North Korean and Chinese systems resemble one another enough that some of these insights may be transferable. However, I offer this presentation as food for thought, and I look forward to your feedback on whether or not it represents an opportunity for a concrete policy proposal. This year, AFSC worked with the National Committee on American Foreign Policy and 4 independent researchers to conduct an exhaustive audit of US-China dialogues. The narrative in Washington, as many of you know, is that dialogue and engagement with China has failed. However, these arguments often rest on sweeping generalizations or the fact that China's economic and political systems haven't come to mirror US systems. So we decided to test whether or not dialogue really failed. And in order to do that, we conducted the first comprehensive examination of US-China dialogue to see what really became of the outcomes of these dialogues. The study quantitatively and qualitatively examined the nearly 1,000 commitments the US-China made between 2010 and 2016 during the Strategic and Economic Dialogue, or the SNED as it's known and as I'll refer to it in this presentation. Keep in mind that the SNED was an official process which started with talks at the working level, culminated in high-level exchanges and joint statements outlining commitments, and then immediately started the cycle over again. It also built on a decades-long legacy of official US-China dialogues. We found that these dialogues made major contributions to global and national security. For example, dialogue contributed to macroeconomic stabilization in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis as both countries coordinated their response. It improved public health cooperation and pandemic management as the US and China, prior to Trump, coordinated on several health crises, including the Ebola crisis in Africa. Dialogue also increased critical cooperation around climate change mitigation. The SNED was instrumental in resolving issues that ultimately allowed China to accede to the Paris Agreement. Finally, bilateral dialogue also improved cooperation between law enforcement and technical agencies on issues such as human trafficking, weapons proliferation, cybercrime, and nuclear reactor conversions. The study found several important attributes of dialogue, and I think these may be the key insights for the US-North Korea relationship. For example, dialogue bridged major differences between the US and China. It bridged systemic differences. China has a top-down model where bureaucrats carry out instructions from superiors, while the US has a bottom-up system where working level officials raise issues up to their superiors for refinement and decision-making. This is a problem US-North Korea relations face as well. Dialogue also bridged differences in expectations. China wanted a high-profile venue, while the US wanted substantive discussions. Dialogue allowed high-profile gathering, which elevated issues to senior levels and got the attention of principals on issues when they were stuck at the working level. And dialogue allowed substantive talks, which evolved over time so that China had more of a stake on the substance. Notably, similar issues exist between the US and North Korean counterparts. Dialogue also bridged differences in scopes of bilateral engagement. Initially, the US was more focused on multilateral global issues, while China more focused on national regional priorities. That changed over time, and China became more engaged at the multilateral level. Dialogue also bridged relative power of convening agencies. While the US State Department has the necessary authority in the US system, the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs is seen as farther removed from the top in China. Official dialogue unsiloed many agencies on both sides and gave the Chinese MFA important, high-profile convening power. And we're all familiar with the similar issues that exist between the US and North Korea. Dialogue was also a key risk reduction mechanism that provided understanding of internal workings of each system. The process helped each side understand the other's political and governance systems, agency jurisdictions, organizational charts, and so on. For example, it helped identify appropriate interlocutors and asks, which is not always clear without insight into institutions and personnel. The size and scope of the dialogue gave it a momentum of its own that allowed it to continue even when unrelated points of contention would arise in the relationship. Dialogue also served as a key action-forcing mechanism, pushing both bureaucrats and principals to take action on items before the next round of dialogue. We also came to the conclusion that progress is much less likely without process. Even when outcomes focused on process, for example, when both sides just committed to keep talking about an issue, the process ensured the discussions would continue, which kept the door open to progress. Interestingly, major breakthroughs occurred even as disillusionment with the US-China diplomacy grew. In fact, major breakthroughs occurred in later years and even after the dialogues ended, suggesting diplomats need a long timetable and that dialogue needs considerable work upfront to deliver results. So it's key to recognize that each governance system involves different processes, some of which can take years before change is evident. Relatedly, it's also important to recognize that because outcomes can't be expected until later, officials need to set expectations accordingly so that they don't come under criticism for not achieving earth-shattering results after a single round of dialogue. Dialogue between the US and China also served as a part of a rhythm of diplomacy where the results of the bilateral dialogue fed into multilateral and global initiatives, something that could be useful in the US-North Korean context as well. A similar, smaller scale official dialogue process between the US and North Korea could be used to address unresolved issues. Dialogue between the US and North Korea has been intermittent, potentially because there are no guardrails or consistent processes to maintain engagement. US-North Korea dialogue is typically ad hoc, working level meetings. Consistent process, though, could ensure talks aren't derailed by outside events and offer the promise of continued working level exchanges as well as high profile engagements. Both are necessary for bridging systems. Note that even high level talks under Trump failed to restart after Hanoi, given that there was no set process. The closest thing to something like the SNED in the US-North Korea bilateral context that I'm aware of, and fellow participants can correct me if I'm wrong, might be the Perry process during negotiations over the agreed framework in 1999 and 2000. The process involved extensive consultations with executive agencies and Congress from William Perry and staff. The Perry process, however, was very dependent on William Perry himself and his staff. So formalizing a process then could help ensure progress across administrations while also dividing the labor among agencies and/or offices. Official regular dialogue processes could address many of the same issues it addressed in the US-China context, such as bridging differences in systems, expectations, and authority of foreign affairs agencies, helping to unsilo stakeholder ministries and departments, serving as an action-forcing mechanism, and could help address a wide range of issues, each on a separate track, but with the goal of showing progress. For example, exploring national priorities would be critical in reestablishing a holistic relationship and build the necessary trust to pursue peace and denuclearization. One example of national priorities that could be explored beyond the obvious is issues around reforestation and climate change mitigation. As you know, reforestation is a national priority for the DPRK. AFSC has facilitated exchanges on reforestation in the past, which has had direct consequences on soil erosion, crop yields, and climate resilience. In the wake of the Singapore summit, we tried to arrange a reforestation delegation that was a priority for our partners, but we were denied the license. This is a critical mistake in diplomacy. These are not carrots to dole out to the North Koreans, but opportunities to rebuild a relationship from the ground up. But this is not understood when there is not a consistent exploration of the other side's interests. In other words, dialogue can help identify these opportunities and develop an appreciation for these issues among officials. U.S.-North Korea bilateral dialogue could serve as an initial discussion venues and feed into multilateral fora for larger peace and denuclearization efforts, perhaps resembling the Iran deal negotiations. As I noted in the beginning, I offer these remarks only as food for thought. With their feedback, perhaps we could determine if a dialogue process is a worthwhile policy recommendation. I'll leave you with 3 open questions. Should the U.S. start by proposing a process instead of or along with substance? How would South Korea fit into these discussions, and does it need to be a trilateral process? And lastly, given that there is low appetite for concerted long-term dialogue in the U.S., is this realistic? But what alternative is there? Thank you so much. I'll end my remarks here, and I'm looking forward to the rest of the discussions.
Thank you. 네, 역시 서로 체제가 다른.
Well, I can see that there are some differences in the political and the government systems, and dialogue and communications and efforts to understand each other are all very important factors, as the presenter rightly mentioned. Seen from the SNED dialogue, you can see that there are a lot of similarities between China and North Korea in the government system. So there can be a lot of good lessons to learn from this experience, particularly with regards to the open questions. The first question is something we would really have to explore seriously. Instead of those contents, if such processes are recommended, would we be, instead of substance, would we be able to make a start by the U.S. proposing a process? We sincerely hope that the U.S. will play certain constructive role. I think this is a very valuable input on the part of the conference. I'd like to extend my appreciation to Mr. Jasper for his very valuable presentation. Now we invite the second presenter to begin the presentation. Ms. Katrina Parsons is going to begin her presentation.
제재에 대응한.
She will present on the U.S. sanctions advocacy and the Korean Peninsula peace. And please, Ms. Katrina Parsons, you may begin.
Yes, thank you so much. Good morning or good evening, depending on where you're listening from. Thanks so much to the organizers of the event, to the other panelists, and to everyone who is there in person or listening in today. I'll be sharing today about advocacy on U.S. sanctions, so I wanted to start off with something a bit concrete and show you all some of the items that Mennonite Central Committee has sent in the past to North Korea that have required these complex sanctions exemptions from the U.S. government. So right here in this, well, if you can see on my screen, in this hand-sewn bag is something that we call a hygiene kit. And MCC sends these around the world wherever our partners might be experiencing a natural disaster or have another need for these sort of items. And the materials inside are things like soap or toothbrushes, basic items that you would find in your bathroom cabinet. But it's illegal to send this from the United States to North Korea without a license. And if you just give me a moment to share my screen now. All right. So the United States has 169 separate sanctions designations against North Korea, banning all imports and exports, and the humanitarian exception to these sanctions only covers food and medicine, not items like soap or toothpaste, hence the need for those long sanctions exemptions processes. And so the question that I'll start out with is how did we get here? Why are a dozen different people from the US State Department, the Department of the Treasury, the Department of Commerce, even the United Nations, reviewing an NGO's application to send washcloths and toothbrushes to a few North Korean hospitals? The rapidly increasing sanctions against North Korea take place in the context of an exponential increase of US sanctions imposed against countries around the world. You can see in this map a sampling of all of the different countries that the United States has sanctioned in different ways. The most updated count that I could find is that the United States has over 8,000 sanctions in place, and this number is rapidly growing. Here's a bar chart from The Economist. President Obama added sanctions at the rate of about 500 new ones per year. President Trump issued 777 sanctions just in 2020. And this has actually continued under the new administration. President Biden has signed executive orders to sanction individuals in Russia, Nicaragua, Ethiopia. And this has wide bipartisan support, both in these different administrations and in the US Congress, which means that our efforts to lift some of these sanctions that impact humanitarian work in North Korea have to push against a foreign policy establishment where this is really the status quo. But the good news, and what I want to talk about today, is that we don't have to be alone in this work, because the issues we have providing humanitarian aid to North Korea are some of the same issues that face humanitarian organizations in Iran and in Syria and in Cuba and in other sanctioned regions. And so even though the contextual realities are different in each of those countries, there are shared US policies and authorities that undergird those sanctions in all of those locations. So advocacy on North Korea sanctions can have a positive impact on the way that the US sanctions the rest of the world, and vice versa. As we advocate against broad sanctions around the world, that can lead to greater humanitarian access and more positive engagement with North Korea. So I'm going to review some of the negative humanitarian impacts of sanctions, not just on North Korea, but around the world, and then some of the work of advocates and recommendations about how to change US policy and what that might mean for North Korea. So before I begin, just a few words of definition. Sanctions are considered coercive policy instruments that can be imposed on individuals, on corporations, on ships or aircraft, terrorist groups, or national governments, entire countries. One of the reasons that it can be so confusing to talk about sanctions and to debate sanctions is that sanctions can mean so many different things. They can be everything from revoking one individual's US visa to barring an entire country from using the US financial system, as is the case with North Korea. But however a sanction is structured, whether very narrowly or much more broadly, a common thread is sort of the theory of how they are meant to work. And I wanted to share here a quote from one of the architects of the United States sanctions regime on Iran, because I think it gets to the philosophy behind US sanctions policy. And this quote, he says that sanctions are intended to create hardship, or to be blunt, pain, that is sufficiently onerous that the sanctions target changes its behavior. And the two words that I want to highlight there are pain and change. We say that sanctions cause pain, and it's true because that's what they are designed to do in part. So as humanitarians, we point out that pain is not necessarily felt by elites in the country, but actually by the poorest and most vulnerable people in those countries, which alone is problematic. But while sanctions are very good at causing pain, they are less obviously good at leading to any sort of substantial policy change. There's really little evidence that sanctions have achieved any US policy goals. And that's, also the United States doesn't formally measure that change. And when you're not actively measuring negative impacts, you can see why sanctions might appear to be an attractive policy. a way for the United States to appear strong without the costs or risks of military engagement. But as sanctions become more plentiful, more reactive, more punitive instead of strategic, we see more and more pain without any accompanying meaningful change. And as I said, it's then the poorest who pay that price. Just a few statistics from some studies on this. A study found that US sanctions reduced a country's GDP by about 13%, and UN sanctions, which tend to be more multilateral, reduced a country's GDP by 25%. And that economic downturn is felt unevenly. So sanctions are really blunt instruments. And the poverty gap under countries who are the recipients of US sanctions is nearly 4% larger than one that's not sanctioned. And that income inequality increases with the duration of a sanction. The longer that a country is sanctioned by the United States, the more unequal it becomes. Another study found that US sanctions reduced average life expectancy by 5 to 6 months in sanctioned countries or locations. And we know that there is an intersectional, a gendered dimension to this as well. A study by Korea Peace Now on the gendered impact of sanctions noted how sanctions particularly impact caretakers or industries where women are disproportionately represented, like North Korea and Iran's textile industry. In addition to these macroeconomic and public health realities, NGOs also face significant difficulty in trying to meet those humanitarian needs. And these will be familiar to many people here, the onerous licensing processes. Not only is applying for these licenses really complicated, often requiring expensive legal counsel, but NGOs also face a constant legal risk just for doing our work. Working in sanctioned locations is so legally risky that banks or suppliers or shippers may refuse to work with an organization that's operating in a sanctioned location, even when that organization has all of the legal permissions to do so. And because of the power that the United States has over the global financial system, the way that US sanctions includes secondary sanctions on non-US entities, US sanctions then become those de facto global sanctions that further isolate countries, which leads, of course, to NGOs having difficulty accessing civilian populations who need aid and prevents the sort of development and peace-building work that can lead to lasting change around the world. So what can we do about this from a US policy perspective? Foreign policy advocacy in the United States can sometimes be country or region specific, but as you mentioned earlier, sanctions are a cross-cutting issue that impact people around the world in similar ways. And so US sanctions policy becomes an interest that can be shared by peace activists, by humanitarian organizations, by solidarity groups. So I wanted to share a bit about the work of a small working group. A few years ago, Dan Jasper on this panel started pulling a few people in DC together to start thinking about a shared advocacy response to some of the negative impacts of sanctions. And out of those first meetings, an informal coalition called Lift Sanctions, Save Lives was born. This has been a really rich space of sharing that has broken down some of those silos regionally and in the type of organization that participates. So in our conversations, you might have humanitarian organizations, research groups, peace builders, grassroots groups, faith-based human rights organizations. And these different organizations can share information and collaborate on letters or opinion pieces or meetings with key administration or other officials. So some of this group's advocacy priorities, which I think are an important point of entry to thinking about advocacy for the North Korea context as well, include calling for impact assessments on sanctions, for improving the procedures and the transparency of granting those humanitarian licenses, expanding the general licenses, what can be sent as humanitarian aid to countries without the need for those long, complicated licensing, addressing the lack of financial access that NGOs find, reforming the way that sanctions are authorized and some of that legislative authority that allows sanctions to be so widespread. And then finally, changing some of the entrenched narratives around sanctions, really amplifying the voices of NGOs who are operating in these countries, and of course, the affected populations who in many cases are calling for sanctions to be lifted. I'll just go through a few of these advocacy points in more detail. Many NGOs, research agencies, or academics report on the negative impact of sanctions. And I wanted to pull out this statistic because it's just so staggering. They found that a Syrian child's overall life expectancy has been reduced by 13 years. But this sort of devastating specific reporting is really just coming from civil society. US government agencies do not do regular, careful reporting on sanctions impact, even as they continue to impose over 500 sanctions per year. So conducting these thorough, regular assessments of whether sanctions are effective and their impacts on the humanitarian situation is an absolute baseline for sanctions reform. Just highlighting briefly a report from a few years ago from the Government Accountability Office, a federal agency, found that agency officials cited difficulties in assessing sanctions effectiveness and have not conducted such assessments on their own. That's just looking at the effectiveness of sanctions. That extra step of addressing the negative humanitarian impacts is not being conducted at any level either. And this has been an area of some movement and also some frustration recently, because when President Biden assumed office, he called for an assessment of the impact of economic sanctions on the delivery of global COVID-19 response, as well as a broader sanctions impact assessment and several country-specific assessments. Now, after 9 months of waiting and promising that this report would be released, one of those sanctions policy reviews was released, but it was very disappointing and did not address the humanitarian impacts that we've been calling, that we need that specific study of. And so our working group is really pushing for these other reviews to be made public and to address the humanitarian issues that we have been highlighting. There's also an amendment in Congress that we're hoping to see passed, a proposed amendment to the US Defense Spending Bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. And this amendment would require regular impact assessment of all sanctions, their effectiveness, and also the humanitarian impact and the impact on the operation of humanitarian NGOs. So this is an amendment that has seen some movement. It passed the House, and we're now waiting for the Senate version to see if this language will be included in the final bill and signed into law. Another opportunity for change is to improve both the speed and the breadth of licensing under existing sanctions, so expanding that humanitarian carve-out. I'm sharing here a quote from one of my colleagues saying that in the midst of COVID-19, it has never been so important for humanitarian organizations to respond and adapt quickly to meet global health and humanitarian needs, and that strict sanctions make that sort of flexibility very difficult. So we're calling for an expansion of what are called general licenses, which is essentially the US government saying that as long as they are sending items within a broader humanitarian category, they do not need to seek individual permission for each shipment. So the US Treasury has been issuing some updated general licenses for some countries, but they generally have not gone as far as humanitarian organizations have asked and don't cover work like development or peace building or other people-to-people engagement type work. Opportunities here include legislation like the Enhancing North Korea Humanitarian Assistance Act that's currently in the US Congress, which would not only expand the goods that are covered under licenses for North Korea, but would also improve transparency, publicly sharing how many applications for a humanitarian license were accepted or denied by Treasury, how long that process took. And another area that we've been, as a working group, calling for is a global temporary general license that would exempt items required for COVID-19 response anywhere in the world. Now, despite some positive support from some members of Congress, that recommendation unfortunately has not yet been adopted. But again, it's a recommendation that's out there and that we're continuing to raise. So impact assessments and improvement of the way that licenses are issued are an important first step. But to see long-term change, we really need to address the root causes of why it's so easy for a US president to issue up to 2 new sanctions per day on average. If we really want to lift sanctions and save lives, we need to look at the mechanisms through which sanctions can be applied and prevent future broad-based sanctions from being imposed on countries. So this graph here is unfortunately too low resolution to read, but it's a visual representation of sanctions timelines that have been imposed under two pieces of US legislation, the 1976 National Emergencies Act and the 1977 International Emergency Economic Powers Act. And what those two bills did was delegate certain authority from Congress to the president in the case of an emergency. So if the US president declares a national emergency, he can then unilaterally impose sanctions or other coercive measures against another country. And those sanctions can only then be overturned by a joint resolution from Congress that's signed into law, which if you follow US politics, you understand how difficult, how high that bar is. Since 1977, presidents have declared 54 national emergencies, 33 of which are still in effect. And the majority of those emergencies were declared in order to impose economic sanctions, many of which did not have clear political goals or guidelines for their removal or really appropriate exemptions for humanitarian actors. And the definition of an emergency is supposed to be something urgent and time-bound, and that is clearly not the case for sanctions that have now been in place for decades without being reassessed. So as a response to this, there was an important bill that was introduced last year, the Congressional Oversight of Sanctions Act by Representative Ilhan Omar. And this bill would amend the National Emergencies Act and the International Emergency Economic Powers Act to limit the power of the president to unilaterally impose sanctions on countries without congressional approval. So it would also require regular reports and add sunsets or an end date, so sanctions aren't able to just continue in perpetuity. These changes would make it harder for sanctions to be reactionary and would allow a path for some of these more harmful and limiting sanctions to eventually be lifted. Now, that bill has not yet been reintroduced in this congressional session, but the language is out there, the ideas are out there, and we hope to see it reintroduced in the near future. And the final point of this coalition's work that I wanted to touch on is just the idea of challenging some of the dominant narratives around sanctions. So I'm including here photos of MCC's work in North Korea, in Cuba, in Syria, in Lebanon, all countries that are under sanctions by the United States. And I think it's really important to remember that the ordinary people who are having difficulty accessing food or basic health items under sanctions are human beings like you and like me, families that want a better life for their children, young people who are hoping for a brighter future. We need to keep reminding people that sanctions have this real human cost, and wherever possible, amplify the voices of people within a country who are calling on the international community to lift these crushing sanctions. Recalling the humanity of individual North Koreans, individual Syrians, individual Cubans also allows us to see them as part of the solution, active agents in peace-building work or people-to-people exchanges. And this is all, I think, deeply connected to the work for peace on the Korean Peninsula. I pulled this quote from one of the Korea Peace Now group's recent statements that affirmed that the Korean War will not be resolved through more sanctions, military pressure, and isolation, but by building trust through dialogue and negotiation. And I think this is where the rich contributions from Dan, from Christine, from the other panelists today come into play, because there are alternatives to policies that punish or isolate, to war or punitive sanctions. Lifting sanctions and reducing the pain that they cause can be a step toward engaging in diplomacy and in good faith dialogue. And in that sense, humanitarian items like the hygiene kits that I showed represent more than just a response to human need. They can also be symbols of engagement that we hope to continue expanding. Challenging the United States' reliance on sanctions as a policy tool can also be part of restarting dialogue and contributing to peace on the Korean Peninsula and anywhere where US sanctions make life more difficult. So thank you very much, and I'll end my remarks there.
예, 발표 고맙습니다.
Thank you very much. It was a very informative presentation, so that is why, even though I was supposed to send the beep sound 2 minutes ago, I was silent. I turned it off. As a matter of fact, when we think of sanctions, the Korea Sharing Movement about 2 years ago, we once visited New York and Washington, D.C. to discuss the North Korean sanction issues, to think of any solutions to that. Back then, the impression that we received was that the stance of the U.S. government is that they regard North Korea as a country where kind of ghosts and goblins live instead of civilians. And that was very unfortunate and very painstaking. As you said in the presentation, the international sanctions of the US government is actually something that surpasses our general imagination, not only in terms of the number of sanctions, but also in terms of the severity or the degree. This is very serious. About 3 years ago, we had a scholarship program for foreign students, including Iranian students. Seoul National University, we had scholarship programs, and about 3 years ago, even the scholarship was banned because of the sanctions toward Iranian students. This went beyond financial sanctions, but it was even impacting students and scholars that were pursuing academic efforts. And we couldn't even endow them such scholarship money that was very necessary for these foreign students to make their living. And I was very impressed by your presentation, and I hope this rings a bell to what we think about sanctions.
넘어가야 될 것 같아요.
And now we invite the third presenter to begin the talks. We invite Ms. Christine And, who is the Executive Director of Women Across the DMZ. She's going to talk about task with U.S. and civil society movements to end the Korean War. Please begin.
Thank you so much for convening this important conference and continuing the groundbreaking work of strengthening relationships across national boundaries and between humanitarian development and peace movements in our collective goal to end the Korean War. Thank you for this opportunity to share my humble thoughts about the future tasks and directions for the US and global civil society to achieve lasting peace on the Korean Peninsula. Let's first begin by assessing where we're at with US policy on North Korea. Since it completed its North Korea policy review this spring, the Biden administration's approach has been somewhere between strategic patience and maximum pressure. Senior Biden officials have said they will honor the Singapore Declaration and pass agreements, while also maintaining continued pressure on North Korea. The US is willing to meet North Korea, quote, anywhere, anytime, end quote, is the common refrain from Sung Kim, Biden's North Korea envoy. But without substantive policy changes to the US hostile policy towards North Korea, Pyongyang has been unwilling to engage. Yet after a long stalemate, there appears to be some movement. According to Politico, the US and South Korea are close to reaching an end of war declaration, but both sides remain at an impasse over how to include language about denuclearization. While this signals, and I believe to many, a positive step for the Biden administration, since the US DPRK relations have remained deadlocked since Hanoi, an end of war declaration is not enough. It's also referred to as a quote unquote peace declaration. An end of war declaration is generally framed in the Korean context as a non-binding political declaration. That is not a peace agreement. In the Panmunjom Declaration, the two Koreas called for three distinct items: an end of war declaration, a peace agreement, and a peace regime. More recently, President Moon renewed his call for an end of war declaration at the General Assembly. It's not a legal term of art. It's only binding under international law if the parties intend it to be binding. Since an end of war declaration does not necessarily legally end the state of war, there are limits to such an agreement's ability to provide the parties with sufficient security assurances to build trust and realize a lasting and stable peace regime. But an end of war declaration, even if non-binding, can still serve as important evidence that the parties consider the war ended, especially if paired with other steps like the establishment of diplomatic relations. Aside from any legal implications, an end of war declaration would carry great political momentum towards a binding and durable peace agreement. What we must press for is substantive changes to US policies. And that includes, as Kate talked so eloquently about, easing crippling sanctions, ending provocative US South Korea military exercises, and lifting the US ban on Americans traveling to North Korea. There's nothing practical or calibrated about maintaining decades of policies that have failed to advance US goals of denuclearization or human rights. What could help advance denuclearization and improved human rights is a peace first approach. As we argue in our groundbreaking Korea Peace Now report, Path to Peace, the case for a peace agreement to end the Korean War. We start with the premise that there is no military solution to the endless conflict in Korea. This is the nuclear standoff in which military escalation, intentional or accidental, would kill millions of lives. What is patently clear is that sanctions have failed to change North Korea and that the status quo fuels endless military spending. What has not been tried is a peace agreement to formally end the Korean War. The closest the US ever came, Dan talked about this in his presentation, was in the final days of the Clinton administration following the Perry process, where the US almost signed a non-aggression pact. What we argue in the Path to Peace report is that a peace agreement that formally ends the Korean War would enable all parties to recognize that wartime rights to use force have ended, and that peace must have no preconditions and should be negotiated at the beginning, not the end of negotiations. According to Thomas Quintana, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the DPRK, quote, "A declaration on peace and development in the Korean Peninsula and a swift resolution of the armistice status would create the atmosphere and space needed for further discussion on denuclearization, less isolation, more access and respect for human rights," end quote. Yet the military-industrial complex, which includes corporate media, politicians, former military officials, and North Korea watchers from academic institutions and think tanks, continue to frame an end of war declaration or peace agreement as a gift to North Korea and the end of the US-ROK alliance. Replacing the armistice agreement with a permanent peace settlement, as promised in 1953 by the US, North Korea, and Chinese military commanders, has no bearing on the mutual defense treaties between Washington and Seoul and between Beijing and Pyongyang. Our job as civil society movements who see the human impact of this unresolved war is to challenge those who advocate for the status quo, continued war and militarization, a dangerous arms race, separated families, and the suffering of millions of North Koreans due to sanctions and isolation. Our job is to tell the true history that the specter of nuclear war that is loomed over the Korean Peninsula began with the US threatening to use nuclear weapons during the Korean War and placing them in South Korea until George Bush Sr. We have to make clear that denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula will remain a pipe dream as long as war languishes on. As Joe Cirincione, the former president of the Plowshares Fund, has said about Women Cross DMZ, he says, quote, that we have convincingly demonstrated that we cannot end North Korea's nuclear program without a comprehensive peace, end quote. We must also engage those who care about the human rights of North Koreans and show that the status quo has not worked. The rationale used by certain human rights advocates is that by not granting North Korea peace or normalized status, the US can maintain leverage against Pyongyang and incentivize the Kim regime to improve their human rights record. Yet how has an unresolved state of war, where governments on all sides pour billions in weapons of mass destruction and preparation for war, ever improved human rights? How have human rights been improved by sanctions that block entire industries, such as fisheries and textiles, that hundreds of thousands of North Koreans depend on for their livelihoods. Why should those of us who advocate for peace and diplomacy have to explain how peace can improve human rights when those advocating for more war, militarization, and isolation are never forced to explain how decades of failed policies will yield a different outcome? This is our challenge as a global civil society movement, to push back on the hawkish narrative and win the hearts and minds to our hopeful vision of a Korean Peninsula no longer at war. Our vision is clear. The old approach is only fueling a never-ending arms race, threatening nuclear war, and harming innocent people's lives. It's time for a new peace-first approach to bring closure to America's longest conflict in Korea. The good news is that recent polls show that more Americans favor diplomacy and peace than sustaining militarism and endless wars. According to a new poll by AFSC and IPSIS, the majority of Americans favor diplomacy with North Korea and China. Of those surveyed, 41% agree the US should end its longest war with North Korea by signing a peace agreement. 52% says the US should establish a diplomatic presence in North Korea, such as the liaison office. The FSC poll also found that 62% believe the US should work with North Korea to reunite divided families, and 70% thinks the US should work with North Korea to repatriate the remains of US service members from Korea from the war. So as we strengthen our movements to work across sectors, peace, humanitarian aid, and development, we must also work to engage separated families and families of US veterans who served in the war. They are the living reminders that the war is not ended and that families continue to be torn apart and unable to have closure. The findings from the AFSC poll also align with another national poll conducted in September 2021 by the Eurasia Group, which found that 70% believe that the US should negotiate directly with adversaries to try to avoid military confrontation, even if those adversaries are human rights abusers, dictators, or home to terrorist organizations. Twice as many Americans want to decrease the defense budget compared to those who want to increase it. And the most cited reason for decreasing the Pentagon budget is a desire to redirect those resources domestically. 2 out of 3 young Americans under 30 believe that the US should respond to China's rise by decreasing US troop presence in Asia. These polls signal to me that there are growing voices in the US who want to end America's endless wars that have not only devastated countries impacted by US military invasions and occupations, but bankrupted US schools, hospitals, and our domestic infrastructure. This is why, despite the enormous power and pressure of the military-industrial complex, President Biden withdrew all US troops from Afghanistan after 20 years. As he announced the US withdrawal, President Biden said he was ending America's oldest war. We know well that, in fact, the Korean War is America's oldest war, and that it was that war which inaugurated the military-industrial complex. In the 3 years of the Korean War, defense spending quadrupled, and the US set out to become the world's military police. Peace on the Korean Peninsula will not only help de-escalate growing regional tensions, but would help reverse America's long march of militarization. Let me close by saying, as President Jimmy Carter has said, peace is the greatest security to both Koreans and Americans. But unfortunately, there are many who still profit from unended war. Many don't realize this, but when President Trump signed the Singapore Declaration, the stocks of defense contractors plummeted. And when US DPRK talks failed in Hanoi, their stocks rose. This is Raytheon, Lockheed Martin, Boeing. There have always been those who profit from endless war, but now there are groups that are financed by an oligarch with business interests
in perennial war. They are using all their financial resources and Cold War tactics to maintain this war. As Gandhi famously said, quote, "First they ignore you, then they laugh at you, then they fight you, then you win," end quote. Well, Cold War relics who seek to maintain this forever war frame our calls for a peace-first approach as quote unquote absurd and destructive, instead of seeing the dangerous nuclear war as a threat to all of humanity. They're attacking US Congressman Brad Sherman's Peace on the Korean Peninsula Act, calling it a fake peace bill that would increase the likelihood of war. Ending a 70-year war is no small feat, but I believe we are closer than we know to ending the war. That's because our vision of peace is too powerful. We have built a global peace movement of multi-generational peace activists, veterans of wars, humanitarian aid workers, divided families, and we're backed by prominent leaders such as presidents, members of Congress and parliaments, Nobel Peace Laureates, business leaders, celebrities. We are the majority. We have the data and the arguments, and we offer the solution. Let's transform the armistice into a peace agreement in 2023 on the 70th anniversary of the ceasefire. Our vision, which is driven by empathy, understanding, and hope, is leading the way to a brighter future for all. I believe we can do it because we are. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With regards to the peace, the treaty, I think this is indeed something we really want. And I think a strong desire and commitment of the peace agreement has been displayed through the presentation. I sincerely hope that we'll be able to conclude the peace, the end of war statement as a first step towards realizing the peace agreement on the Korean Peninsula. I sincerely hope that we'll be able to come to a substantive result very soon. Now I'd like to introduce the fourth speaker to begin the presentation.
We'd like to introduce Secretary General Hong Sang-young of the Korean Sharing Movement. The presentation will be on experiences of reconciliation during cooperation with North Korea, seeking to resume cooperation with a joint response to COVID-19. Hello, everybody. I'm Hong Sang-young from the Korean Sharing Movement. The topic I'd like to talk about today is about the people in South and North Korea. Experience of meeting people to people, person to person, and how such a person-to-person experience can change the thoughts and mindsets of people. I'd also like to talk about how we could continue our meetings and how we can prepare for such future contacts and meetings. Mutual understanding. The meaning of understanding in Korean means to be able to assess the other person's situation and to be able to accept it generously. So this means mutual understanding between South and North Korea would be to have South and North Korea being able to assess each other's situation and accept it generously. South and North Korea have remained in a state of mutual hostility and in separation for almost 70 years. So for us, conflict, distrust, walls are more familiar to us rather than words like reconciliation, trust, and cooperation. For Koreans, since the armistice state has lasted for such a long time, we somehow mistake the armistice situation is peace. Since 1990s, based on the agreement of the two Korean governments, inter-Korean exchange and cooperation between citizens of the South and North has started. And so in food production, healthcare, reforestation, there were many cooperation and exchange between the two Koreas. as well as on cultural exchange projects. And in that process, naturally, we had the chance to meet with people of the north, and the same was true for me. And what I realized was that South and North use the same language and share the same thousands of history. So at first, I expected that we would be so similar, but once we started meeting, we came to realize that we have so many differences. So the more we met, the more differences rather than similarities we found. So this made us realize a deep sense of how different the realities that we have lived in. What we read right now is to understand and be aware of one another for both South and North Korea. We need to see the real other just as it is. We need to accumulate the experiences of every day with one another. Let me share my personal story with you. In 2006, the Korean Sharing Movement were working on a rice cultivation project in a cooperative farm in North Korea. And this is the site of the project. We see a very large rice paddy. We decided to spread fertilizers. And we provided the fertilizer, and we happened to make a visit. And one of our agricultural experts came to me and quietly told me that it seems that the North Korean people are spraying less fertilizer than we had agreed and provided. And he told me quietly. And the instant I heard this, two possibilities flashed my mind. The first is that they are siphoning off some of the fertilizer to use it somewhere else. So, of course, this group is a group of people that cannot be trusted. So I was not wrong in my perception. So I went to the leader of the cooperative farm and I demanded to know what happened. I became angry and I asked him why they didn't give enough fertilizer. Was it to dismiss the effect of this project? And this was the protest. Well, because that was what I thought deep in my mind. So this was how I criticized them. Of course, they started saying that was not true. And I remember I was very angry and upset that day and came back to my room. And this is the fertilizer. I remember shouting aloud, and I remember myself shouting that we will need to count each and every one of the fertilizers. And there was a staff that was serving as our guide came to me that night. And he told me that it was true that they were using less fertilizer, but he wasn't aware, and it wasn't that they were trying to use it somewhere else. It was because some of the work groups wanted to spray the fertilizer on different parts of the rice paddy because in North Korea, fertilizer was very scarce, so they wanted to spread it to other farmlands. And this was very understandable after I listened to his story. And I came to understand the behavior of the farm laborers. And as I listened to his story, I then thought about myself, and this came to my mind. That is, even back then, it was at a time that I've been doing the Inter-Korean projects for about 6 to 7 years and have been meeting with North Koreans. And I regarded myself as someone who knew North Korea very well. But the moment I heard that less fertilizer was being sprayed, my immediate response was that they were hoarding the fertilizer. And I thought, what was I thinking about? Why was it? It was because of the anti-communist Cold War education that I received during my childhood was dominating my consciousness. So, rather than thinking reasonably and trying to ask why they did that, my immediate response was mistrust, was not trusting the North Korean people. I believe that for all South Korean people, this type of deep-rooted mistrust is deeply immersed in our mindsets. I think this is a result of the long-standing wall of separation and division. In order for South and North Korea to mutually understand each other, we have to have small experiences, everyday incidents that could bring down this barrier. These small everyday lives should be accumulated to foster trust. That was what I realized through that experience. And so, when we think of these meetings, sometimes we could quarrel and sometimes we could hurt each other. But as we see in the photo, people are baking or cooking Korean pancakes together and sharing them, and they would talk about their daily lives. And this is a process to create trust. So the more frequent the meeting is, the more comfortable we become of each other. That was what I realized. So some examples could be forestry cooperation projects and the nutrition projects and the pig farm projects and also building children's hospitals. And in these cooperation projects, we could broaden our scope of understanding. And these projects continued up to 2010. But with the May 24th measure of 2010, everything came to a stop. And in 2018, we had expected that they would resume. But with the failure of the Hanoi meeting in 2019, it once again came to a suspension. And now, from 2019, due to the COVID-19 situation, all types of contacts or exchange or aid has suspended. I truly believe that this type of exchange and cooperation is urgent than anything else. As you can see, the Korea Sharing Movement's previous projects are shown in the figures. On the left-hand side, we see the assisted items, and on the right-hand side, we see the number of visits to North Korea. We see that they have a similar trend. With greater aid to North Korea, we see more visitors visited North Korea. And this is the government and the NGOs' assistance to North Korea. And we also see a similar trend with the visitors' number to North Korea. So the bigger the assistance is, the more frequent the visits become, and vice versa is also true. So we see that items, assistance, and people-to-people exchange should go hand in hand. But the COVID-19 situation put a challenge to everything. So I like to pose two issues. I like to make two proposals. The first is to overcome the COVID-19 pandemic. Once the pandemic broke out, North Korea closed all its borders and blocked all forms of personal and material exchange. So, and I think this situation is very difficult. I believe that the citizens in North Korea are suffering deeply. They don't have enough necessities, and the fatigue from the public health officers would be tremendous. If we don't ensure quarantine in North Korea, then it will also impact other parts of Northeast Asia. So quarantine of North Korea impacts not only North Korea, but also necessary for South Korea, Japan, as well as China. So that is why I argue that the international community should cooperate. And the first measure would be to support vaccination. We need to support sufficient vaccination for North Korean residents of up to at least 50,000 doses, so that at least 80% of the citizens in North Korea are vaccinated. I truly urge the South Korean government and the US government to take the lead. And believe that at the civil society level, we should also make efforts. We will support North Korean hospitals and work on establishing a system to provide the support measures. So it's important that North Korea could convert itself and could shift to a with Corona mechanism instead of locking its borders down. The second is that, as we've said previously, we need to find ways to implement cooperative developmental projects despite the sanctions on North Korea. And also, we have to have the sanctions relieved. And at least for humanitarian assistance to North Korea, and also for direct type of cooperation projects with North Korean citizens, we urge that the UN should relieve its sanctions against North Korea, or at least be flexible in making approvals of the licenses for North Korean assistance. This is critical to relieve the survival issue of North Korean citizens and also allow people-to-people exchange between South and North Korea. Relieving sanctions against North Korea and also providing an expansion of license exemption for humanitarian assistance would be a very important step for us to meet with North Korean people and also to expand the scope of exchange and cooperation with North Korea. And so I think it's important for us to all work together in that direction. And with that, I'd like to conclude my remarks. Thank you.
네, 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Secretary General Hong. He has a long experience on site in North Korea, as well as various cooperative projects. So there was an emphasis on the pandemic situation. Just like we're working toward a with Corona mechanism, it's important to also work with North Korea so that they could also shift its stance. We've listened to the 4 presentations of our 4 presenters, and we have 3 designated discussants. First, I'd like to invite Lee Tae-ho, Director of the Center for Peace and Disarmament of the People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy. Mr. Lee, please.
The microphone is not being used. I'd like to extend my appreciation to the organizers for giving me this very valuable opportunity to speak. And I also extend my appreciation to our colleagues in the United States and also experts for joining us today. I'm very delighted to see the familiar friends' faces through the video, and it gives me a great pleasure to be here today. And I also thank Mr. Daniel Jasper for his very informative presentations. I'd like to briefly talk about his presentation. When it comes to the U.S.-China relations, I think it was very informative for all of us, given the implications that it has on our country. He talked about the Paris process, taking a long-term perspective, and taking a very stable and consistent the steps to make improvement. I think that was a great learning. It was a great learning experience for all of us. And I think an approach like this is something that the U.S. government knows already. And the reason I say this is because if you look at the Singapore, the U.S. DPRK summit, they issued a joint statement and they said that the establishment of a new U.S. DPRK relations is going to contribute to the peace on the Korean Peninsula and the world. In recognition of such changes, we believe the new awareness can lead to new steps for denuclearization. So this is a position that's been shared upon and agreed upon by the leaders of the 2 sides. And the confidence-building measures are required, and also the new efforts to build new relations would be required. And a process needs to be there to enable such progress. And you need to engage in the dialogue in a very committed manner. And I think that is why we won't be able to see much progress being made at the Hanoi summit. And you've raised 3 questions, Ms. Jasper. And you said you talked about the making a proposal on not the substance but the actual process. Would that be meaningful? And of course, I agreed that process is indeed meaningful. But as you can see from the Singapore summit, there should be like a genuine commitment for an agreement from the negotiators' point of view. Because if you look at the United States, you see that they maintain the CVID position at the Bush administration. So this is basically the U.S. Would want North Korea to denuclearize first. And that is why the confidence building may not be built up as high as people desire. Would we be able to engage in 3-party discussions? Would South Korea fit in? If you think back on the days of the 6-party process, many countries participated to the U.S. DPRK dialogue. So we did have that experience, and we had close consultations with North Korea to go along with these 6-party talks. And if the objective is to come up with an end-of-war declaration, and of course I do believe that there are already the talks going on separately with other players to come to an agreement. So I do believe that such negotiations has taken place in the inter-Korean discussions. I am sure that this can happen in the future. Now, if you think about this low appetite for this concerted long-term dialogue, this is realistic. This is the 3rd question. And I don't think I'm in a position to respond to this question. I think this has to do with a change in the position of the United States in the administration. So many people say that there needs to be a change in the hostile policy maintained by the U.S. administration. Why did Paris process fail in the end? You have to think about the lessons learned from the PESI process. The process was very good in this concept, and I think the proposal was very constructive at the time. People responded in a very positive manner. I think we have seen improvement, advances in U.S.-DPRK relations at the time of the Paris process. But I think there was a general perception, a deep-rooted mistrust that people have, the Americans had, on the North Korea, that North Korea is a rogue nation. It should not be treated as, in this way, and that North Korea may collapse very soon. So we should not be making commitments to a country that is doomed to fail very soon. I think this kind of perceptions had led to high levels of distrust, and this trust has led to forming a great threat. Because we also know that at the time of the Paris process, we did not have North Korea did not have ICBM. North Korea did not have nuclear programs. And North Korea is now able to pose a threat to the United States directly with these ICBM missiles and the nuclear programs. They even say so themselves, so you have to think about that as well. And this, I think, what Ms. Katrina Parsons said about the sanctions is quite significant, about us needing to analyze critically about the U.S. sanctions regime. Many sanctions have been posed. There have been sanctions against Iraq, and there have been sanctions imposed to Afghanistan before the 20-year war. There have been many different sanctions mechanisms in place previously, so we need to closely analyze those sanctions mechanisms in order for us to draw lessons. But I think when it comes to the DPRK sanctions, I think we have come up with certain analysis already. North Korea developed a nuclear program, and they advanced their missiles when the talks broke down. So we can conclude that North Korea did not advance their missile and the nuclear weapons upgrades when the talk was going on. North Korea never so-called succumbed to the U.S. threat, and they strengthened their military capabilities during the Cold War. And it's very clear. And from my point of view, the way I see it is that the U.S., it would be too costly for the U.S. to resort to means such as waging a war. And the chances of them winning a war in the Korean Peninsula is not that high. And that is why, because it's less costly, they are habitually resorting to imposing sanction regime on the North Korea. They don't have a strategic objective to come to a solution on this issue. I don't see such intent in the United States. From the civilians' point of view, those who are being imposed with the sanctions, there's a lot of sacrifices and a lot of pain felt on the part of the residents there. You have to think about that. In this, I call on the presentation by Ms. Kristen Ant, very energetic and appealing talk on ending the Korean War, about the peace, setting peace as the first priority and making such approach. I think this is a very realistic approach and I applaud her for her presentation. And when it comes to the coordinated and pragmatic approaches of the Biden administration, I don't think there's anything substantial in it, and I don't think it's quite coordinated or practical. So in this, I call on the United States to take a more active stance, to take a more peace-oriented approach, so that we can achieve peace and end the war in their efforts. I think we should pressure the U.S. administration to take on such path. And above all, I'd like to say that in the war against Afghanistan, so what happened is that they claim to have waged the longest war in a foreign country, but we have the longer war that's been waged for a longer period of time, which is the Korean Peninsula. It's been going on for 71 years. I agree to Ms. Christina's point of view. We also hope that the Korean War would come to an end. And in particular, I sincerely hope that it will come to an end on 2023 to commemorate 70 years of the end of the armistice war, the agreement being signed. I sincerely hope that the international campaign led by Korea Peace Now and the women across DMZ will be promoted. We are taking a part in this global campaign. We want a world without nuclear war, no war to the Korean Peninsula, and we would like to overcome this issue without resorting to threats. And we would like to make investments to the people and to the peace instead of investing for the war. We are engaged in a campaign to get signatures from all over the world, and we are taking part in this campaign together with women across DMZ and other organizations. We'd like to end the Korean War by 2023, and we would like to reach out to other countries, United States, Korea, China, and the sending states of the Korean War. We hope that there will be participation from other parts of the world to this campaign. Now, when it comes to the Korean peace process, the administration, the Moon Jae-in, the government has been strongly advocating the peace process, but they spend too much on the weapons. If you look at the defense budget of the Republic of Korea, it's more than 1.5 times the GDP of the North Korean economy combined. If you look at the past 20 years of military spending for this South Korean government, it's more than what the North Korea has generated in GDP for the past 20 years. Would that be a realistic thing to do? If you're promoting peace, someone has to make concessions. If someone has to propose for peace, would that be North Korea? Would that be Republic of Korea or the United States? Who should play that role? I think the role should be played by the stronger party, the one who has exerted more pressure, the one who has built more military arms. They should be the one to reach out first to open a path toward peace. So we may be rather one-sided in our approach. We may be very subjective in our approach. In this, I extend my appreciation to the presentation by Mr. Hong Sang-young, and I fully agree with him. And with that, I'd like to end my discussion. Thank you very much.
발제에 대한
Well, thank you. It was a very sharp criticism and words of support given by Mr. Lee Tae-ho, and he raised an issue with regards to the high military spending of the Republic of Korean government. Would that be the intention of the Korean government or the intention of the military industrial complex of other countries that the Korean government chooses to spend so much every year? I believe that we need to think seriously about this issue. Now invite the second discussant to begin the discussion.
부탁드립니다.
Secretary General Choi Hae-kyung of the Okedongmu Children in Korea. Yes, I'm Choi Hae-kyung of this Okedongmu Children in Korea. I'd like to thank you for inviting me to such an important venue. I listened to 4 presentations today, and as I listened, I kind of looked back on our activities and what we've done, and also had a chance to think about what we have been doing and our future direction. And this is under the theme of seeking an integrated approach to cooperation with North Korea and peace on the Korean Peninsula. And as a practitioner of humanitarian assistance, I'd like to share some of my thoughts and opinions as a designated discussant. For over 25 years, for the NGOs, South Korea's provided humanitarian assistance. Basically, there are 2 experiences. First, because of the stalemate of inter-Korean relations, North Korea refused assistance from South. And secondly, South Korean government prohibited us from providing assistance. That was a general situation that we mainly experienced in the past. But these days, in addition to these 2 situations, the pandemic situation led to a lockdown of the borders. This is a very unique situation. And another unique situation is the UN sanctions. Under the sanctions, we need to have our humanitarian efforts proved to be humanitarian assistance, and we have to also have it proved to be something consistent. These type of complicated issues are surrounding us as we want to provide humanitarian assistance. So for South Korean NGOs, under these complicated situations, are continuing its work for peace settlement and inter-Korean cooperation on the Korean Peninsula. And in that process, so what would be the direction we should take? And we ask ourselves the same questions as well. And at the same time, for that question, we must admit that it's very difficult for us to come up with a very clear answer to that because of this complex situation, and it's making us very frustrated. Nevertheless, I would, as I listened to the 4 presentations, I could see that as people who are, I could understand that there are colleagues that are taking the same path and are sharing this experience. And it made me somewhat consoled and also reassured and encouraged. First, as I listened to Mr. Daniel Jasper's presentation, regardless of who the subject is, trust building kind of make us have a similar experience. There are many civil NGOs in North Korea, just as Secretary General Hong mentioned, in their humanitarian assistance activities. One thing that we realize through our work is that trust is the outcome of cooperation, not the precondition of cooperation. We cannot force the other to trust us. We first have to be trustworthy counterparts, and that will be the beginning of creating trust and also maintain trust between the 2 parties. That was what we realized in our experience of humanitarian assistance. And as I listened to the presentations today, what I also felt was that trust is something that we should show first. And in that process, we have to foster the capacity within ourselves to accept differences and also to adjust the differences between the 2. I think at least we now have that level of capacity to a small degree. When we think of this topic of an integrated approach to cooperation, I'd like to share some of my recent thinkings. Recently, there was a presentation on sanctions and also the lack of flexibility on humanitarian assistance. And what I felt was that we ourselves should also look back on our own activities under the sanctions regime. For example, when we think of humanitarianism and development and peace and cooperation, and when we think of a so-called integrated approach, we also thought about a so-called long-term and comprehensive umbrella, and also some kind of international criteria or standard for doing that. And Sometimes we might be under that standard and that umbrella, but sometimes we somehow forget why we set that overall direction and umbrella and standard in the first place. For example, when we think of humanitarian assistance, right now, under the pandemic situation, North Korea shut down its borders, so they don't accept any type of items from outside. And just as been mentioned by the presenters, of course, the sanctions on North Korea is impacting, but from certain NGOs, the border shutdown is also another impact because this blocks us monitoring. So we cannot provide humanitarian assistance unless we have transparency guaranteed. That is one of our guidelines. Of course, we must continue humanitarian assistance where we can have transparency guaranteed. But if we think of a universal standard or this universal umbrella of guideline that we've said previously, I think we have to look back on what was the starting point of that. I want to share one example of a Korean NGO. From 2019, a direct South to North Korea contact is all impossible. So we need a medium of a third party in overseas. That is the only way we could provide humanitarian aid. Many South Korean NGOs still have the same concern because going through a third party to aid North Korea, it may be a solution to humanitarian situation in North Korea, but at the same time, in terms of peace building and improvement of inter-Korean relations, we all agree that it will not have such a big impact or effect in improving the situation. And if we continue relying on a third party, we may end up losing the capacity to have an inter-Korean direct contact and cooperation. So that is why many South Korean NGOs prefer a direct contact, a direct cooperation with the North instead of relying on third party. But this did not go that well, just as President Che mentioned in the opening remarks. There were many challenges, and what is the situation today? There are so many reasons, so many causes that we cite and say that inter-Korean projects is not being done well. But we must admit that we're also not making that much efforts as we did in the past. We blame some other issues for not doing enough. I think that is the situation today. So we have external cause or a universal standard that we set previously, and we seem to be over-reliant on that. And I think this somewhat makes us oblivious to what we need to do and how passionate we used to be in the past. I think that is something that we have to think about. It seems like blaming on external factors for what we are incapable of doing. And I think we are somewhat justifying ourselves. Well, maybe you might not be doing so, but for myself, I kind of make this type of retrospect frequently. And just as I listen to Ms. Christina, peace and humanitarian assistance and development should all be encompassed and in our direction. I truly agree what you said for our civil society movements. When you look at the various solidarity agencies, we see there are diverse backgrounds. And I think, and on a closer look, these diverse organizations and their relationship with their counterpart of North Korea is the top priority. And what we don't see that much is kind of a overall understanding among ourselves, that is, among the civil organizations. I also listened to Ms. Katrina Parsons, and you also talked about a so-called collective advocacy against sanction, and that made me feel something very deep. We had individual efforts, respective organizations made respective efforts, and I think this, when it is shared collectively, this could create a new insight to other organizations. So the Korea NGO Council for Cooperation with North Korea as the U.S. State Department about the vaccination support. And for that, I understand that the American Friends Service Committee provided a very precious support. So I'd like to take this chance to express my gratitude. And I think we should go beyond just a simple sharing of information. I think we should go one step further to create a solidarity and coalition among ourselves. And I look forward to this being a reality. And for our civil organizations, I think we should also expand our scope of solidarity. Previously, our main focus was on advocacy to improve perception related to North Korea. But from a different perspective, for the issues like discrimination and hatred in our societies, if we don't overcome such basic barriers, I think the peace and cooperation on the Korean Peninsula could be something very challenging. So I think it's important to expand our scope of efforts in these universal challenges. In many international conferences, so we could listen to many voices of the civic NGOs, and this session was also very valuable in that perspective. But I think we have to take one step further and to think of more concrete actions and create a more progressive relationship among ourselves so that we could share insight among one another. Thank you very much. And thank you for keeping with the time also. And now, our last discussant.
Dr. Kim Dong-jin, who teaches at Trinity College Dublin as a research fellow. He's going to begin his discussion.
Thank you very much. I'm getting some feedback. Okay, now. So thank you very much for the thought-provoking presentations and fascinating discussions. As previously mentioned, COVID-19 pandemic has demonstrated interdependent nature of an ever more globalized world. There have been international cooperation initiatives such as COVAX to counter the pandemic together. Nevertheless, vaccine supply shortages, inequitable global distribution of vaccines, and an unprecedented scale of border closures have increased concerns about the humanitarian situation in fragile, low-income countries. And the situation in the DPRK exemplifies the impact of the pandemic on humanitarian development and peace efforts in conflict-affected societies. For years, aid organizations argued that engaging with North Korea was based on humanitarianism in order to prevent politicization of the aid to the vulnerable population. As the pandemic hit, however, such humanitarian assertions could not shelter aid efforts in North Korea. And unless North Korea secures sufficient COVID-19 vaccines for its population to reopen the border, it seems implausible that humanitarian development and peace organizations will be able to engage with North Korea again. And therefore, it requires not only humanitarian, but also diplomatic and political solutions. As we all know, primary causes of the withdrawal of international aid workers in March this year were the far-reaching COVID-19 quarantine measures and border closure of North Korea. But it was also due to financial restrictions caused by the international sanctions. And sanctions, especially the UN sanctions, have been recognized by the international community as a non-violent collective security enforcement mechanism. However, the morality and utility of sanctions are debated, as Kate mentioned. According to the UN list, most of those who are currently under UN sanctions are fragile states suffering from ongoing poverty. There is continuing criticism, again, that the sanctions rationale about the utility of economic pain for political gain demonstrates how sanctions are a form of violence as opposed to the claims that sanctions are a non-violent alternative to military actions. International sanctions against fragile countries could cause death and suffering through structural violence on a scale exceeding the unfavorable alternative of war. Furthermore, as in the case of North Korea, civilians could be more greatly affected than the military and the elite, especially those dependent on international aid. In other words, the humanitarian impact on civilians seems to show a contradiction between the UN pursuit of political goals utilizing sanctions under the UN Charter and its parallel commitment to the human rights provisions of the UN Charter. In this sense, the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in North Korea, Thomas Quintana, mentioned and argued in his recent report to the UN General Assembly, and I quote, "Sanctions imposed by the UN Security Council should be reviewed and eased when necessary to both facilitate humanitarian and life-saving assistance and to enable the promotion of the right to an adequate standard of living of ordinary citizens," end quote. And the UN panel of experts on North Korean sanctions also continue to argue that sanctions on North Korea tend to take a disproportionate toll on the most vulnerable segments of the society. And on top of that, scholars such as Hazel Smith argue that it could very easily have been anticipated that sanctions were unlikely to bring about denuclearization. And despite the increasingly comprehensive sanctions since 2016 and during the COVID-19 pandemic, the North Korean regime appears unmovable. The regime continues to stress the need for improving citizens' lives in the face of a grim economic situation. However, there has been speculation that North Korea is maintaining income for the state and supplies for state-controlled traders to sustain the regime, while majority of the population suffer from the humanitarian situation. And in this sense, as the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights argued, sanctions should be reviewed in order to facilitate humanitarian and life-saving assistance to North Korea. Given the traditional understanding of the nature of international relations in which states formulate their foreign policy almost exclusively based on national interest, providing humanitarian assistance to people who are not in their jurisdiction will seldom be considered as a meaningful source of state action, but as charity work by philanthropy. However, I believe that the COVID-19 era would be the time to end the quarantine of humanitarian action from international relations, as captured in the phrase, "No one is safe until everyone is safe," and exemplified by the recurring upsurge in new variants of the coronavirus. International health cooperation can simultaneously embody strategic action for national interest and normative action to take global responsibility beyond philanthropic action. And this convergence between normative and strategic actions in COVID-19 cooperation between donor countries and North Korea is different from instrumentalizing health for political agenda. If the priority of the COVID-19 assistance is to coerce North Korea to satisfy donors' diplomatic leverage, this strategic action to bargain with people's health would fall into serious moral question. And of course, the undertone of the conversations about the health issues of North Korea in the COVID-19 era will still reflect motives based on the political interest of all parties involved. If, in fact, everyone at the table will be talking about COVID-19, but thinking beyond it. The question of who provides and who delivers the vaccine influences both international perception and diplomatic reality. In fact, when the initial COVAX commitments fell through, there was concern that China and Russia may fill in the role of vaccine provision, and the US and South Korea may lose diplomatic leverage on North Korea. A vaccine provision to North Korea was framed as an opportunity to push the needle forward on political and security issues. And in this sense, North Korea perceived that COVID-19 assistance cannot be purely humanitarian, but an instrument to achieve other diplomatic goals of these countries. For example, in July this year, the DPRK Foreign Ministry website stated, and I quote, that the American ulterior intention of humanitarian aid in the global pandemic is to legitimize their pressure on the sovereign states and achieve their political scheme, end quote. And however, I still believe that the North Korean reservations about the donor-driven nature and the potential hidden agenda could be addressed if the stated goals of health cooperation with North Korea are global responsibility for equal access to vaccines and enlightened self-interest of the donor countries, which is health and safety of their own population in the global health crisis. In this sense, I have a couple of follow-up questions to our speakers. First, the gatekeepers of humanitarian development and peace cooperation are multiple, not only the US and ROK governments, but also the DPRK governments. And their decision-making process is more often than not based on political positions, not normative values such as humanitarianism and peace. And in this sense, in tandem with our efforts to address the negative impact of international sanctions, what would be then strategic and practical ways to communicate with our North Korean partners to resume the humanitarian development and peace cooperation at a time when they are politically not willing already? And second, the intensification of US-China rivalry appears to be one of the significant obstacles in the Korean peace process. And the US-China dialogue could certainly change the atmosphere for peaceful cooperation with North Korea. I understand that there has been a debate surrounding the utility of the Cold War analogy in the context of East Asia. I would appreciate hearing further on your thoughts on this, Dan, especially about the impact of the US-China relationship on North Korean position towards South Korea. Are they interconnected or separate, in your opinion? Thank you very much.
네, 고맙습니다.
But thank you very much also for the keeping time, for being very punctual. I think when it comes to the international cooperation to provide assistance to DPRK, there are a lot of considerations to be made. And I think all in all, we are keeping the time. We have heard 4 presentations and 3 discussions. And we are receiving questions from the YouTube as well. And I would like to know if the panelists from the presenters and discussants, if they have any questions for each other before I open the floor for the general discussions. So, with regards to the presentations made so far, are there any questions from the audience? Excuse me, from the panelists? Questions or discussions?
물론 특별히 없다면
From the panelists, excuse me. So if not, if the panelists would not respond, let us move on to receive questions from the audience for the general discussion.
다들 너무
And I understand that the panelists and the discussants don't have any additional questions or comments. Well, let me take about 2 to 3 minutes myself to make a brief comment. When we think of this type of discussion and humanitarian assistance on the civil level, and also cooperation on a civil level is very important. And just we listened to Mr. Hong Sang-young's presentation. But in South Korea, we have to go with the government. That is a must. It's something that we cannot choose. But sometimes we mistake the South Korean government to be a somewhat self-led or somewhat so-called independent government. President Trump, former President Trump, said that it is impossible to do anything without the approval of North Korea, of the U.S. We even have postal numbers in our land, and we also see THAAD deployment or Jupiters, such biological weaponry systems, are being deployed on our land, on our territory. So without any collaboration or discussions from the South Korean government. And when we think of the reality that Korean NGOs have to work with the South Korean government to assist North Korea, well, right now, we must accept the reality that the South Korean government is kind of a tributary nation, a kind of a tributary government to the US government. And I think it is now time that we accept the reality and have to join the hands of the government. The Minister of Unification, when visiting the Daejeongni village of the DMZ, it was the UN Command forces that disapproved, and the governor of Gyeonggi province wanted to relocate the office to near the DMZ, but this was also disapproved and was not allowed by the UN forces. And so we have to accept this reality of a power imbalance. And if we don't accept the reality and just talk about the theoretical principles, I don't think we could be that helpful. We have to consider what the South Korean government is doing and also what we could do. And these two parties have not been able to truly exercise what they've wanted to do under the regime of the UN during the past 70 years. And we have to accept that history and the reality as we go ahead in our inter-Korean cooperation projects. So with that, I'd like to share some questions from our YouTube channel. This is a question to Ms. Katrina Parsons. It's important to make sure that the voices of the people in the sanctioned country are heard. And to do this, it's important to work with the residents of the sanctioned country, and also cooperation with the citizens is very important. But actually, this is very difficult because of the sanctions themselves. So I wonder what kind of efforts your organization is making to pursue a direct cooperation with the residents of the sanctioned country. So could you give a reply to this question, please, Ms. Katrina?
Yes, thank you for this question. It's a really great question, and I wish I had a better answer. It's true, we have limited access within the country when we do travel to monitor. And work inside North Korea is very sensitive. So for the safety of the people we work with, we can't really publicly attribute quotes to individuals, even when we do hear some of those statements. I think that as an organization, a way that we address this is to share information in an aggregated way. So for example, we can talk about how sanctions on fuel can impact agricultural output, which can impact food security, without attributing that information or telling an individual family's story. I think in the specific case of North Korea, we can listen to NGOs who do have this history of engagement, or people who have been able to travel or participate in exchange processes. Also, sometimes it's possible in more of an interpersonal, non-public statement to share things with a bit more openness. And another idea that comes to mind is to recognize the solidarity between people who experience these profound sanctions, and highlight some of these direct quotations or voices of people from other regions, from other countries, and where it may be easier to have those individual attributions, and make that connection about how people in North Korea face similar impacts of sanctions. But I would be also curious to hear if others on this panel have thoughts about ways to center those voices, because I do think it's so important moving forward.
네, 아직 통역이 진행되나 보죠? 네.
Yes, I believe this provided a very good reply to the question. Considering the citizens of the sanctioned country and our communication, this is a challenge that we all face. And we also have a second comment.
I think this is an opinion that I share, that the basic spirit. That are quite a bit of violations of the international law when it comes to sanctions. And also we see situations that inter-Korean cooperation on the building roads and railways have been blocked because of sanctions. What is your assessment about this, the international sanctions? I do believe the assessment and re-violation of the sanctions must be made. This is more like a comment, so I thank you very much for your comment. I'd like to move on. Next, when it comes to the media plays an important and major role in shaping the public opinion for the end of war declaration. I wonder how the panelists are responding on media-related matters in their respective positions. And also there is another note. For example, the joint military exercise between South Korea and the United States imposes great pain, inflicts great pain upon the North Korean residents as well as the South Korean residents. So what will be the role of media in shaping the public opinion for the end of war declaration? So we'd like to hear from the panelists on their views.
뭐 당연히
Of course, on this issue. This question, I think, is more directed more to the Korean panelists and discussants than the international participants. Yes, why don't I give you a quick response on this issue?
우선
Okay. Yes, as was mentioned by the moderator, the co-president Woo Hee-jung, you have to take a very realistic approach. And I think there's a certain paradox in making such a statement about making a realistic and an approach. Now, if you recalled what I have talked about previously, from the Korean perspective, from the Republic of Korean side, of course, and people think that we are in a peaceful situation, a situation of peace. But this isn't actually, because we have an armistice regime, a truce system in place, and think about North Korea. They are being inflicted with great pain. We may be enjoying a lot of abundance here. We are not being inflicted with pain. So things do not seem to be very problematic here, but North Koreans are being inflicted with great pain as we speak. So is this kind of peace sustainable? That is a question I have. Another point about taking a realistic approach has to do with the kind of impact created by the sanctions regime. I think you have to think about the effect that has been created from the regime. Did the international sanctions regime prove to be effective? From the U.S. point of view, North Korea developed nuclear weapons. They successfully launched the ICBM missiles. So the sanctions regime may not have been successful. From the North Korean authorities' point of view, from the North Korean residents' point of view, they developed a nuclear program and they developed the ICBM, interballistic missiles, to put on the warheads. Are they in a more favorable situation? No, I don't think so. The situation has deteriorated further. So from both sides, the sanctions regime did not prove to be effective. That is a reality that we are looking at right now. So I don't think we should be looking at a downward spiral. Instead, we need to take a different approach. And one way to do that has to do with the comment made by Mr. Lee Tae-ho, Director of the Center for the Peace and Disarmament. I think we need a change in our strategy. And one of that is to put an end to the military exercise. I think the joint military exercises impose a great pressure on the North Korean side. And North Korean authorities also said that to me once. And we need to take a preemptive actions to resolve the problem. And the way to do that is to reduce the size of the Korea-U.S. joint military exercise. This is needed as a precondition. So I think we need to resort to some way to find a breakthrough. Otherwise, it could be said that the two sides do not have a strong commitment to resolve this situation. Well, thank you very much. Yes, please hold for a second. And I would like to say that we are looking at a lot of responses on this issue. So when it comes to peace and the role of media, Mr. Lee Tae-ho has played a leading role in engaging media as well. And we also ask for Ms. Christine An to respond after Mr. Lee Tae-ho. So Mr. Lee Tae-ho, would you like to go ahead?
Regarding the declaration of end of war And when we think about its meaning and about the limitations of that, I believe that Executive Director Katrina has given us a very clear explanation and briefing on the situation. For creating peace on the Korean Peninsula or for progressing negotiation, the declaration of end of war could be beneficial. But the reality is that trust between the two has been weakened. So on the first hand, declaring end of war will not be easy itself, and rather declaring the end of war itself could actually cause a different type of conflict. So we have to think of the fundamental issues of creating peace on the Korean Peninsula, and we have to think of the end of war in a more fundamental manner and link it with some more progressive issues, just as Secretary General Hong mentioned. And one would be negotiation. And there could be a strong player in taking an upper hand, which is the US and South Korea. And we could think of freezing defense budgets or suspending the US Korea military exercises, or provide a kind of a preemptive relief of sanctions unconditionally. We should create this type of an opportunity or momentum and create a kind of environment and atmosphere for end of war declaration in the diplomatic sphere. And just as Mr. Jasper mentioned, we could create a kind of a linkage between the peace process and the end of war declaration. And when we think of this, not only the end of war declaration, we also have some other issues to consider, which is on a comprehensive level, which is to bring down mutual level of risk. And for that, the South Korean government and the media in South Korea are not actually doing enough. They're just talking about the theoretical issue of whether the end of war statement is possible or not, or whether South Korea has the statements ready, has them prepared, or will North Korea accept it, or will they be provocative? This is a very one-way consideration of this issue. We have to think of the relevance of this issue. These are so theoretical and superficial. So when we think of what can actually be realized and who should take the first step, we have to have our media and also the civic groups raise their voice, and also the intellectuals and also the politicians raise their voice. But the ruling group or the dominant group in Korea don't want to take that risk. They just want to. All they admit is that the end of war is the remnant or outcome of the Korean War. And another issue we have to consider is the US-China rivalry. When you look at the UN forces in Korea or the Korea-US combined forces, we see that they have such a strong footprint in Korea. This is something everybody regrets, including the Minister of Unification. And it is frequently mentioned by many players here. For US to strengthen its influence and to utilize the resources of the nations in the region, they emphasize the role of the combined forces as well as the UN command forces. So that is why they put great emphasis on the operational command as well. Raising the level or or putting more emphasis on the role of the U.S. forces in Korea is in that angle as well. Well, in Japan, they don't have enough land troops. It is a reality. Their self-defense army cannot actually take action outside of the nation because of the international law. So the only military force that the U.S. could rely on in the Indo-Pacific region is the current forces on Korea. So that is also being pointed out. Mr. Lee has made a reply on the military issue, and I think this should be linked with Mr. Kim Dong-jin's comment because they are very closely related. And for that, I'd like to ask Ms. Christine An's comment on this issue.
Thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to just quickly respond, because I think in many ways our challenge to end the Korean War is a battle about winning the hearts and minds of people that are either uninformed or on the fence. And I think part of the reason why I gave the speech I did today was because I feel that being against peace should be a shameful thing. We heard General Abrams say that an end of war declaration would be a gamble. What is a gamble? But right now, placing 80 million people on the Korean Peninsula at the threat of a war, you know, how is that a better or more secure path? So I feel like we kind of need to go on the offense. And I think having videos like the one that you shared today, having more people that are with us be visible to make statements. I saw today that Yonhap News got sanctioned because of promoting articles that advance business interests. So how do we ask? How do we ask politicians? How do we ask the people that have a position about being opposed to the end of war? How about we ask them, how are they personally profiting from continuing the state of war? And I think we need to have that kind of critical, when we have that critical framework and we ask those critical questions and we amplify our messages of peace, of hope, of love, of empathy, of understanding, that we could win. We could overpower those dark and negative forces that have no solution. They're just feeding on hatred and fear. And we have to own that we are the ones with the solutions. And so I encourage us to keep doing this. I loved Hae-kyung's recommendation, which is it's not enough to share information. How do we actually, create working committees that take on certain issues? There is going to be the next UN Special Rapporteur on North Korea human rights appointed in next summer when Thomas Quintana leaves. He has moved the understanding of human rights in a significant direction, and we cannot go backwards. We have to go forward. And so we need to work together to ensure that the next special rapporteur has that baseline foundation and that is actually a proponent of peace and humanitarian aid and development. So my last thing is, who knows BTS? Because we need BTS to help us with coming up with a song, or even saying, it's time to end the Korean War, Korea peace now. So let's do it together. We are on the right side of history, and 71 years is enough. We can do it.
예. 희망의 메시지로.
Yes, that was a message of hope. I hope that we could be able to hold hands together and march towards realizing peace. We need a strong commitment and actions, concrete actions to realize that goal. And I think we can wrap up this Q&A session with the general audience. I think this is a question from Dr. Kim Dong-jin to General Jasper. And this is on the impact of the U.S.-China relations on North Korea's position toward South Korea. If you think about the reality of the current situation, there is containment by the U.S. on China, and there is a strategic competition going on between the U.S. and China, and it impacts the Korean Peninsula directly. So are they interconnected? Are they separate? We'd like to ask Mr. General Jasper to respond to this question.
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. And I appreciate the topic of conversation there. I think the question really could be a panel in and of itself. It's quite a complex conversation. I'll just say a couple things. One is, the idea that we're facing now a new Cold War, I think is useful as shorthand. But at the same time, it's important to recognize that the U.S. has had a long history in Asia, basically carrying out a foreign policy that is a misunderstanding of what China is. And I think that that continues and is especially noticeable when we start to talk about North Korea. One big example that comes up quite often is that you hear people, excuse me, in Washington, D.C. mention that we need to put more pressure on China so that they can in turn pressure North Korea. And I think that this is, it's sort of a ridiculous notion to think that we're in a huge competition mode or conflict mode or whatever you want to characterize it as with China, and to expect China to basically carry out U.S. foreign policy objectives. And so you can see a sort of underlying, what James Bradley described as the China mirage. And I think that that has implications for the entire region. But linking it to the Korean War, I think, is also important, because with the Korean War, we did see the outset of a U.S. strategy to maintain military hegemony throughout the world. And if the United States does not necessarily have a competitor or use its force in Asia to maintain that hegemony, that entire prescription for foreign policy and grand strategy is under threat, right? And so in some ways, this is a continuation of a policy that was set forth with the Korean War and played out throughout the Cold War in other hot conflicts such as Vietnam and what we saw in Afghanistan today. So I think there's so many elements here that it's very difficult. And when you put in South Korea into the equation, it becomes even more complex. South Korea has a very interesting and important economic relationship with China. I think North Korea understands that and understands that it has some leverage in terms of pushing back on South Korean asks and things of that nature. But when it comes to the US-China relationship in general, and when it comes to the North Korean peninsula, or excuse me, the Korean peninsula, I think it's such a complex question that in general, the US and North Korea could carry forth a diplomatic strategy that would not necessarily threaten China, and China could probably get behind. And to me, it represents one of the points in which US-China relationships could come together to solve a problem. I don't know that US foreign policy experts and officials see it that way, but I do. I think it's one point where actually a lot of progress could be made and a lot of trust could be built in that quadrilateral relationship, if you will. I think there's a lot more to be said on that, but I'll just say that I think I would recommend to folks to read The China Mirage by James Bradley, which gives a lot of great background on this relationship and its importance, and the importance of the Korean War in this relationship as well.
네, 아주
That was a very complicated question, and thank you for your very detailed and in-depth answer for that. We also have another question coming in. We have a presidential election coming up next year, and it is likely it will also impact the inter-Korean relations. If we have a conservative president coming up, what do you think? How do you think this will impact the inter-Korean relations? What kind of impact will it have on the Korean Peninsula? I think both candidates of the current election seem conservative to me. Well, I think you catch the question. So who could answer this question?
제가 그 앞에
Well, I'd like to remind you of the speech, which is more like a keynote presentation, which he made in the opening speech, the speech made by the President, standing President Choi Won-gyu. Now, there are the conservative candidate and the progressive candidate competing against each other. And I think it will be very difficult to come to a solution on the inter-Korean problem by those candidates. And I think it's based on our experience over 30 years. And I say that is because if you look at inter-Korean relations, the North Korean problem is regarded as the political, politicizable issue, something they can politicize, and as long as they do that, they won't be able to come to a solution. When it comes to North Korean or the inter-Korean issue, I think it's very important that the conservative and the progressive factions come up with a consensus. They need to approach this issue in a very consistent manner based on a mutual consensus. And this is a lesson I draw from the past experience. What I want to say is that it could be the People Party candidate, the Conservative Party candidate, or the Democratic Party candidate, the progressive candidate. Whoever is elected as the president, I'm hoping that either one of them would propose to the other that we come up with the joint the political activities to overcome the inter-Korean problem. Otherwise, we would have a very serious, we would be faced with very serious problems in the future. I'm very concerned about that. We won't be able to come to a good solution unless we cooperate together between the conservative and the progressive parties. Yes, when it comes to the presidential election in the U.S.,
what we requested was who becomes the next president. They should keep with the commitments at the Singapore dialogue. So no matter what, who becomes the next president, all civil NGOs would truly wish for the improvement of inter-Korean relations and also improvement of North Korea and U.S. relations. So for the Secretary 19th and the April 17th statements, we truly hope that they become kept with. When we had a new administration in 2008, so the Lee Myung-bak administration made the June 25th declaration, and the Inter-Korean Dialogue's statement of 2010 was dismissed by the then President Lee Myung-bak. And this led to a significant retreat in the inter-Korean relations. And I think this somewhat led to creating a kind of a military momentum for North Korea to start developing their nuclear weaponry. And since I have this chance to make my comment, I'd like to talk about the U.S.-China relations. When we think about the failure of U.S. in Iraq and Afghanistan, this is a kind of a given reality. And when we think of the so-called pivot toward Asia and think of U.S.-China relations, I think there's a kind of a repeated mistake of the U.S. But I think we are not currently assessing that mistake in this region. U.S. made many attempts to take the upper hand, hegemony in the Afghanistan region. From 2009, in the Indo-Pacific region, U.S. made so many initiatives which all resulted in failures. Just as the freedom of the Initiative for Freedom and under the international law, which is creating violations to put more military pressure. And if it continues to try to mobilize the allies of the region, I believe it won't be too long when U.S. will have its influence weakened in the region. If U.S. doesn't truly go in the direction of peace and reconciliation in the region, I think U.S. might repeat its failure in Iraq and Afghanistan. I think U.S. should keep this in mind. That was a very grave warning, so to say. And we have another question.
선생님께 질문.
This is a question for Katrina Parsons. From your point of view, of course, you would have your shared difficulties because of the North Korean sanctions in place. What can we do in Korea? What then can the Korean people do to more actively promote peace on the Korean Peninsula and to improve inter-Korean relations? What can the Korean people do from your point of view?
Well, one thing that comes to mind is some of these grassroots coalitions that have been forming in the United States, like the Korea Peace Now grassroots conferences. As they've all moved virtual, there's been more opportunity for people from South Korea to join some of these study sessions. And we've even discussed what might it look like to have a lobby visit where US constituents are lobbying their members of Congress, but maybe some people from South Korea are able to join to share their perspective and desire for peace, or help us with some of the talking points to make sure that they reflect what you are hearing there as well. So I think I would love to continue that conversation in some of the spaces where we are, how we can include you in this new virtual reality and some of the advocacy work that we are doing.
네, 아니 이 질문에
Well, thank you very much. On this issue, Ms. Choi, would you like to respond as well?
Well, I think this is all interrelated to what we've been discussing today about about the role of the media and the upcoming presidential election. Director Lee Tae-ho talked about the end of war, and also, in a sense, when we think of the role of NGOs in the future, I think we have to think about this on a multi-level. NGOs may put advocacy or pressure for the end of war, which is on an institutional level, and on another level, in order to sustain the relationship, I think we have to have the general consensus and support of the public of Korea. Without that, we will lose the motivation for inter-Korean relations. So what could we do? I think it's also linked with today's topic. Well, the general public of Korea think that the UN sanctions is on a very broad and military level. They are not aware that it even bans us from sending a needle for injection or basic daily goods. So related to inter-Korean relations and cooperation with North Korea, I think it's important that we raise the awareness of the situation that the sanctions of UN of US is a barrier to all these things. And also, when we think of the current military division and how it is impacting on our daily lives, I think it would be very useful if we give actual examples and detailed stories, just as Ms. Kristan mentioned. Well, we try to tell people something, but it's also important to make the other people to raise their voice, to share something themselves. And I do agree with that. And at the same time, lastly, for international society and our government, instead of just requesting these two bodies, we should also try to think of what we could request the North Korean government. Somebody mentioned that we have to be realistic. Today, as we talk about sanctions, this is what comes to my mind. Despite the sanctions imposed, North Korea continued developing nuclear weapons, and this is on a system level, on an institutional level. I think for the general people of Korea, South Korea, I think they don't link these two about nuclear weapons and sanctions. The general perception is that the starting point is not the sanctions, but the nuclear weapons, not vice versa. So I think we have to think of changing the framework of perception. We have to think of the gap between what we think and the general public think. I think we have to first recognize this disparity. And otherwise, I think we won't be able to have a fundamental solution to this very fundamental situation, because it's so much far away from the reality of the general public. Thank you very much. That was a very sharp observation. I asked a question to Ms. Che, and now we have some follow-up questions, but I think your previous answer already covered these upcoming questions. So let me just read through the questions. This was a question to Ms. Che Kyung. When we think of inter-Korean relations and cooperation, it has been in a stalemate for over 10 years. Inter-Korean cooperation projects regards this North Korean citizens on a person-to-person level, and also contributed to reconciliation. As such, this person-to-person meeting and contact is so precious. So I want to ask for your opinion to resume such a relationship. And I think your previous answer already gave a reply. Well, I think we are now at a time that we are supposed to conclude today's seminar, and I don't see any more questions coming up on the YouTube channel. And I think it is now time that we can wrap up today's conference. We have discussed a very critical theme. We've listened to opening remarks as well as presentations. Thank you very much. I think as we add on to these efforts, I believe it will contribute to peace and prosperity on the Korean Peninsula. And with that, I'd like to conclude the 2021 International Conference on Peace and Development on the Korean Peninsula. Thank you very much.